Okay, good afternoon. I think we'll get started. I'm sure there'll be a few stragglers coming late as they make their way through security. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Wilson Center. I'm Christian Osterman. I direct the Global Europe program here at the center, and delighted to welcome all of you to this event, which we are co-sponsoring with our colleagues at the Asia program here at the center. The center, as many of you know, chartered by Congress as the official memorial to President Woodrow Wilson, is what we'd like to say is the nation's key nonpartisan policy forum for tackling global issues through independent research and open dialogue to inform actionable ideas for Congress, the administration, and the broader public policy community. Today's event is very much one that fits with our vision of global Europe, looking at Europe's relations with Asia and its implications for the US. The precise title, I guess, is Between Alignment and Competition, Europe's Pivot to Asia and Implications for the US, with some very distinguished speakers. François Rivasseau, Leo Michel, and Nicolas Casarini. I'll introduce all three of them in a moment. Let me just say thanks to Emily Buss, who is running around somewhere helping us, helping the final attendees to get organized here. And I want to also thank Nicolas Casarini for really conceptualizing and inspiring this session. Today's discussion will address the respective European and American pivots to Asia and the ways in which they compete with and complement each other. So Europe and the US weigh issues very differently vis-a-vis Asia. The US pivot has sparked much debate in Europe on whether to align with Washington or to adopt a more autonomous position. Our speakers will discuss these issues in more detail, and then we'll hope to involve all of you in this discussion. We'll start off with some introductory remarks, and so it's my privilege to welcome Mr. François Rivasseau to the center at this time. You have lengthy speakers' biographies in front of you, so I won't go into all that much detail, but let me just allow to touch upon a few highlights. Mr. Rivasseau was appointed deputy head of the EU delegation to the United States in April 2011. Prior to that, he served at the French embassy to the United States. So he knows Washington well. He has spent much of his career working on disarmament, security, and multilateral affairs, including as head of the NATO desk in Strategic Affairs and Disarmament Department at the French Foreign Ministry. He later served in Switzerland at the French mission to the Conference on Disarmament and took part in negotiations over the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, as well as the Ottawa Convention banning landmines. Mr. Rivasseau served as spokesperson for information and communication at the Foreign Ministry, returned to the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva as the ambassador and permanent representative of France. He's a native of Bordeaux and holds degrees, holds a number of degrees, a PhD in law from the University of Bordeaux. He currently serves as a member of the advisory board on disarmament of the UN Secretary General. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Rivasseau. You have the word and the floor, and I think you're going to talk a little bit about why Asia matters to Europe and why Europe should matter to Asia.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the center, to Wilson Center, to both programs on Europe and on Asia. It's really a privilege to be with you. We follow closely your work, one of the best in town, and we are particularly interested by this opportunity, which proves the interest and the sharp analysis of the Wilson Center. For once, we are not asked to comment about the US pivot to Asia. For once, we may elaborate in our full right about the European pivot to Asia. Because there is also a European pivot to Asia, but obviously with our bad knowledge of Hollywood, our grey capital in Brussels, and our terrible bureaucracy, we are not so good than you to present things. And our pivot has been much less spectacular than yours. Trade is also usually less spectacular than security. And our pivot did start really just after 2000, and indeed our first real milestone, as I see is rightly pointed out, is 2003, when we really began to launch a strategic reflection on what to do with Asia. Because why Asia matters to Europe? Because Asia obviously directly affects first European interests. Economically, through our trade and investment relation, EU is the world's biggest market and trading bloc, and now it represents more than 26% of EU outward investment, and the proportion of trade is a bit lower, but is similar. And growing quickly. If I may add, sometimes when we talk about the pivot to Asia, and I discuss that with sometimes I had the privilege to discuss that with Kurt Campbell himself, the great theoretician of that, and we were telling him, yes, US is trying to rebalance its security commitments from Middle East mostly to Asia, which is certainly sound things to do, if you can. But economically, we may have a good story to tell also, because if your trade represents with Asia 23% of your global trade, now the fact is, slightly more than the EU, the fact is that if you look at the share of the Asian market, the share of the Asian market for the US has been divided by 2 in the 20 last years, while the Europeans have maintained and even slightly increased their share of the market. So we consider that on the most competitive market of the world, which is probably Asia, Europe, in the economic competition with the rest of the world, has not done so poorly. And so when I hear here and there in some other think tanks, less inclined to look at hard facts and more to trust about representation, who say, oh, Europe is not as efficient economically as the US, it may be true, but when it comes to competition in Asia, it's not true. So it's important for us, in the same way that it's important for you, but probably even more. You have to understand that for us, it's probably seriously more important than even for the US. But also Asia matters to Europe, and this is something that is usually totally discounted in the political military circles in Washington, except here and some other place, obviously. But Asia matters very much politically and strategically to Europe. Don't forget that 50% of world trade in tonnage is passing through the South China Sea. And a lot of this tonnage is going to or from Europe. And that's why Europe has taken, despite its weaknesses, try to take some forward-looking position in global challenges like piracy or non-proliferation. Non-proliferation, I remember the surprise always in Department of State when I come to tell them we are interested to discuss North Korea. What, Europe? Why, for God's sake, is Europe interested in North Korea? Yes, we are. We are in a global world. Anything which disturbs trade in Eastern Asia is affecting us very directly. And it can have also consequences, strategic consequences. You surely know that, for example, in my country, France, we have engaged and now almost completed a very, very costly program to refit the tubes of our nuclear strategic submarines. For what? For being able to deter North Korean attacks. So we have been obliged to increase the scope of our missiles, which were mostly designed to deter a Soviet attack during the Cold War. But at the end of the 90s, we decided that we had also to be able to deter an attack which would come. And you know that in nuclear fields, you have to project in 50 years. So we did assess in France that in 50 years, we could be threatened by North Korea. We had to deter North Korea. We were not able to. We had to be able to. So, you know, when it comes to security, it's not true that it has no interest. We are able to spend much for this kind of consideration. But why Europe matters to Asia? You know, we have concluded FTAs with South Korea. We are with Singapore, which is very ambitious. We have talks ongoing with India, not very forthcoming, I have to say, Vietnam and Malaysia. We are about to launch an FTA negotiation with Japan, and you know that if Japan has decided to join the TPP, it's also because of that. We are in an exploratory phase with Thailand and Indonesia. So, you know, when the US administration says, oh, we have a TPP, we have not taken the same approach, not a global one. We considered that maybe a bit too ambitious. We wanted to be able to have a more differentiated approach because we knew that we were able to go much, much further with Singapore, let's say, than with Thailand, Malaysia, or even Vietnam, despite our community of language. So we have not taken a one-size-fits-all, but we have taken a diversified approach, but which is in its ambitions and in its results certainly as ambitious as the TPP approach, and possibly complementary of it. We consider that the TPP help us, and we hope that the results we got through the FTA will help also the US efforts in TPP. But obviously, we remain also economic competitors with the US on that. So there are the two dimensions. We have a common interest with the US in establishing a common level playing field, as you say, as ambitious and as high as possible to increase standards. We have a very common interest in getting Asia to accept our own global standards about international property, about cyber security, about space and space satellite security. There are many more in security of investment. There are many more. The list is so long. I don't go through the whole list, but we have a whole huge list of common interests that we have to promote together in Asia. Some of them purely trade, but some of them like cybersecurity or security of transit in high seas, like in South China Sea, a code of behavior in high seas. We have this common interest. And we have also a sound competition. I invite you not to see that competition so much as an American-EU competition, something which makes less and less sense in the global world of today and tomorrow, but as an intra-company, as a transatlantic company competition. Because, you know, when you look at the most famous competition of all between Boeing and Airbus, don't forget that 47% of Airbus spare parts are built up in the US and 42 Boeing spare parts are built up in Europe. And the capital of Boeing and Airbus is not exclusively American or exclusively European. There are also shareholders on both sides of the Atlantic. So let's realize that what makes the unicity of the transatlantic links is the fact that we have, despite some tariffs and regulatory barriers, much more regulatory than, by the way, than tariff barriers. That's why TTIP is all about. We have a community of economy already. Don't forget that, because otherwise you will miss where the future is going to. And we shall still be fighting the fights of the last century and not the fights of this one. Why Europe matters to Asia? EU remains the largest economy in the world, so we are the big market for them. Only the US is in the same link than you, but we are also, as an EU and its member state, if I add EU and member states, we remain also the largest overall donor of official development in Asia, and we are still, and relatively advanced, more than the US, the main investor in Asia. Now, it is true that as EU, if we have a leading role in investment and aid, we don't have a leading role on the headline hard security issues, given the absence of major military assets or base in the region, and the fact that we have not yet achieved much in terms of defense unity as an EU. We are just beginning and very balbuciating. Perhaps our greatest value of the EU in the region, and why we are still there, is to act as a principal champions of rules-based cooperative security. We are seen as engaged but not threatening a player. That's maybe where our added value is different. And for all its faults, and there are many, the EU is seen by most people in Asia also as a possible example, I would not say a model, but as an example of reconciliation and regional integration. We have been able to enlarge our community of democracies from 6 till 28. we have been able to close the Second World War in Europe. We have a treaty, the 2+4 or 4+2, as you prefer to name it, in 1990, which put a final point to the Second World War in Europe. This has not yet happened in Asia. They are still in Second World War times when you look at the Russian-Japanese relationship, Japan-Korean, Chinese-Japanese, Taiwan, all that proves that still the Second World War terrible legacy has not been entirely swallowed in this region of the world. So we have also here a good story to tell them. And also we are able to do some things which are more easy for soft power than for hard power, but that some hard power found difficult because we do things sometimes in a different way. Take our approach on piracy, where we not only have had a very successful naval operation, Atalanta, but we are also active both and offshore with training, capacity building, judicial reform, working with regional partners. And Asia, and particularly China, but also India, is looking at what we are doing against piracy and imitating us. So there is cross-fertilization in many fields between Europe and Asia. I will conclude with one point which is often forgotten. In the US, it is difficult to have a global vision of why Asia matters to Europe and vice versa. Because you tend to consider, oh, Europe doesn't exist militarily, and they are just cynical traders ready to sell your grandmother for some money in Asia. That's the image Europe has. This is extremely reducive. You don't understand if it's so. You don't understand that we have an Asian population in Europe which is not second to the Asian population in the US. Doesn't come necessarily exactly from the same countries. In France, we have mostly Vietnamese and Chinese. But in the UK, they have mostly Chinese from Hong Kong and Pakistanis, if you enlarge Asia to Pakistan, and Indians, obviously. But don't forget that for a country like the Netherlands, the Indonesian minority, and particularly of Eastern Indonesia, is extremely important. Politically, you cannot work with Indonesia, with the Netherlands, if you don't take into account its Indonesian dimension. Portugal is a bit less. But the flow of Asian immigrants generally in Europe is very high also. And the flow of tourists has become very recently, since 4 or 5 years, a real phenomenon of society. 7 million of Europeans visit China, but much more Chinese today begin to visit Europe. All these figures show that there is a human exchanges, a human dimension between the two continents, or the two parts of Eurasia, if you want to make a sort of discreet smile to some of Russian ideas, which is second to none. And this is followed by universities. When I have the time, twice or 3 weekends a year, I go back to my own university in Bordeaux, a very traditional one, where I still I'm gifted enough to give to the college some intervention in foreign relations in FIDI. And I look at my students. And you know what? 10 years ago, they were going to UK and Germany and Spain in the context of Erasmus. 5 years ago, they were coming here. They were all seeking stage in bookings in DC, in the US. But since 2 years, they go in Asia. They go in Shanghai, they go in Beijing, they go in Seoul. Not even in Japan so much. That is older, but they go there, like yours. So you know, it's also a consequence of the fact that we live in a global world. We live in a transatlantic economy, but don't imagine that the young Europeans are different from the young Americans. And this gives you, in my view, the right focus to envisage what we are ready to do and what we try to do. I conclude with just one last point. President Tusk has given his first phone call to President Obama on the 1st of December, the President of the Council of Europe. He called President of China the second day. But if I may just say so, I'm not sure that he was invited by President Obama, but I know that President of China has invited to come immediately to China.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Rivasseau, for these introductory remarks. I think they really set the scene well for the discussion that we hope to have here today. So now on to our distinguished other speakers. When we launched the Global Europe program here last year, the Europe's relationship with Asia was really one of the central aspects that we wanted to look at. And so we've been extremely fortunate to have Nicola Casarini here as a public policy scholar for 4 or 5 months now, and helping us move the program in that direction. And as I mentioned, we owe the inspiration for this session to his work here. He is also a non-resident associate fellow for East Asia at the Institute of International Affairs in Rome. His current research focuses on the response of the US and EU to China's rise in the post-Cold War period. He was a research fellow and senior analyst at the European Union Institute for Security Studies in Paris from 2010 to June 2014. He holds a laureate in political science from the University of Bologna and host of other degrees, including a PhD in international relations from the London School of Economics. He has published widely on EU foreign policy, Chinese foreign policy, East Asia security. Let me not list all of them, but just point you to the latest publication, his Wilson brief that came out today on how Europe and the United States can boost cooperation and manage competition in Asia. It's available for all of you outside. Feel free to take a copy, and it's also available online. So Nicola will start us off, start in a minute. Let me also say that we're extremely fortunate to have one of this town's leading Europe and security specialists with us today, Professor Léa Michel, who is a distinguished research fellow at the Institute for National Strategic Studies at the National Defense University, concentrating on transatlantic defense and security issues. He served for over 17 years in the office of the Secretary of Defense. His positions included Director for NATO Policy, Director for Non-Nuclear Arms Control, among many others. Before joining the Defense Department, he worked in the Directorate for Intelligence in the Central Intelligence Agency, and also on the Hill as a legislative aide on national security matters for a member of the U.S. House of Representatives. And prior to that, as a reporter for the French media. He was previously a U.S. Navy officer serving aboard the USS John F. Kennedy. He holds a master's degree from Johns Hopkins, SAIS, and a bachelor's degree from Princeton. He's also widely published. His commentaries have appeared in a variety of international domestic papers and journals. Right now, he's distributing these two on NATO Deterring Russia, Declaration, Deeds, and Doubts, published in the European Leadership Network. We can make copies available of that if you're interested. He will provide comments on Nicolas' presentation, and I'll also invite Ambassador Rivasseau for some additional comments if he has any, and then we'll get into a discussion, I hope, with all of you. With that, Nicolas, great to have had you here, and look forward to your remarks.
Thank you, Christian. Thank you to all of you. It's a great pleasure to spend time at the Wilson Center. Before coming to the Wilson Center, I worked, as Christian mentioned, almost 4 years, 3.5 years, for the European Union, for this agency, which is based in Paris, overseen by the High Representative. At that time, it was Ashton, now it's Federica Mogherini, and funded by the 28 member states, where I had as a task to provide some ideas on what the European Union should do or could do towards the Asian region. And I am actually very thankful for what François Rivasso said, because he excellently set the tone for the discussion. Now, I'm in the excellent position now to be more a scholar than a policy analyst in my previous reincarnation, which means that my presentation will be a bit more, let's say, also focus on the things that could be an issue in transatlantic relations. But I also agree with François Rivasso that there's much in common that the transatlantic allies have in Asia. But I will focus more on the distinctive characteristics of the European own pivot towards Asia. And I'm very happy that I will be joined afterwards by Léo Michel, who has done some important research, possibly the only one in America that has done substantial research on how the Europeans have reacted to the United States pivot and what are the implications for Europe. But let me start by identifying what it is, the so-called European pivot. When in 2011, Hillary Clinton published the seminal piece article in Foreign Policy underlying a shift in focus away from Europe and the Middle East and into Asia, which later became known as the pivot and afterwards as used rebalancing, immediately reactions started in Europe. The immediate reaction was more about you're abandoning us. But then the second reaction was, okay, but we also have a lot of interest in Asia. What can we do about with the United States, but also alone? So we'll concentrate more on this part of the debate. The debate also entailed a kind of a self-reflection in Europe about what was the distinctive approach towards Asia and what were also the characteristics which were different from the approach by the United States. Now, the first one, of course, is the approach towards China. There's no secret in saying that the Europeans and the Americans approach China differently. This is not only for commercial reasons. I think there's also a fundamental strategic aspect here. For America, understandably, China is possibly the most ominous long-term strategic challenge to America's global primacy and to the particular liberal international order which has been created and is still maintained by the United States. So therefore, the United States pivot or rebalancing want to make sure that the international, and in particular in Asia, the US-led order in Asia is not disrupted by China's rise. I think on this point, we agree in Europe. There's no problem with that. However, for us, China is not only a competitor or a strategic challenge. It is on economic issues, on other issues, but it has also been an opportunity for the European Union to emerge as a global player, possibly the best opportunity for the European Union to emerge as a global player in the last years. And that's why you find it in the brief, and also François Rivasso mentioned it, we can say that our pivot, the European pivot to Asia, actually started in 2003 when the Europeans and the Chinese signed the comprehensive strategic partnership. For the first time, the Europeans would enlarge the scope of their cooperation with an Asian country beyond the trade to include high-tech, defense-related issues and monetary issues. Now, you have here identified possibly the three main issues that in 2003 really started this new, what we can call a new rebalancing of European engagement towards Asia. Now, in the case of China in 2003, it was about cooperation on space technology in the joint development of Galileo in 2003. Then there was the proposal to lift the arms embargo, which is currently shelved, and the informal commitment by the People's Bank of China to diversify reserves away from the dollar and into the euro. We will go more in that. But let's focus, for instance, on space. Now, at a certain point, we had problems in China, but in 2012, the cooperation between the European Union and China on space was enlarged to include Earth observation, space exploration, and space technology development, including improvement of compatibility and interoperability between their own satellite systems, Galileo and Beidou. Pay attention to that. The year before, in 2001, US Congress had passed an exclusionary law prohibiting NASA from using its funds to host the Chinese visitors and from working bilaterally with the Chinese nationals affiliated with a Chinese government entity or enterprise. Again, I think we have a lot in common, but as a scholar now, in this incarnation as a scholar, I think it is also important to start identifying the different approaches. We, in Europe, we think that cooperating in space with China is a good thing, and I also believe in that. We can hopefully socialize China into the international society, etc. But what it is striking is the different approach taken in the United States. We cooperate on space with China almost across the board in many different aspects. Here, Congress passed a exclusionary law prohibiting cooperation with China space. But that's one of the examples. Let's go into another example. I mentioned before the idea to lift the arms embargo. Now it is an issue which is shelved. It will never be presented at any European Council because some member states have already declared that they would veto it. So it's not an issue. However, European companies continue to sell arms to China. And although we have an arms embargo, according to CIPRI, which is the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, which keeps a database on arms sales, European companies account for almost in between 7 and 10% of China's defense procurement budget, which is quite substantial. The United States have a different approach. They first of all don't sell arms or weapon systems to China, not even dual-use technology, but also they try to maintain a balance. They have a system of alliances, so they try to maintain a kind of balance, let's say, between Taiwan and China, between Japan and Korea, and in particular between Japan and China, etc. So that's again a different approach that we can call it. Doesn't mean that there could not be areas of cooperation. It doesn't mean that it is not understandable. Both the European and the American aerospace and defense sectors need international markets. And Asia, as François Rivessu said, is the most competitive, most important market. So it's understandable that there's competition. I'm just underlying, and I'm going to leave the political implication to the deputy head of the delegation. It also means that different approaches lead to different also outcomes and also capabilities acquired by China in this case. And then I also want to enlarge the scope beyond China, because space cooperation has not been limited to China. Since 2006, the European Union, which is developing a civilian system, Galileo. Important to note, it's not unlike the GPS or Russian GLONASS or the Chinese Beidou controlled by the military. In Europe, the system is controlled by the European Commission, the European Space Agency, decided to enlarge, so to have cooperation with any country in the world, so not just China, anybody. And so we decided, so since 2006, to enlarge cooperation to include now countries like South Korea, India, and on space industrial cooperation, also Japan and Taiwan. Again, arms sales, of course, they also don't happen only to China. It is in particular in Southeast Asia where you have more competition between American and European defense companies. So we already have here a kind of like an European, we can call it like a rebalancing or attempt to promote its aerospace and defense interest in Asia starting in the last decade. It wasn't just aerospace and defense interest. It was also about trade, which has always been there, but like as Rivessu mentioned, a lot of FTAs have been signed in the meantime. But also like another aspect, which is sometimes overlooked here in America, some Eurozone members also started at a certain point to promote the use of the euro. Now, it's good to have like the euro in foreign reserves, but also like for certain countries, again, China, it has also become a political issue. Now, you have some data here, like the euro now accounts in between 25 and 27% of the foreign reserves of Asia's major central banks. When it comes to China, in China it is a state secret to reveal the composition of the foreign reserves. Not even the IMF has data. The data that you have here, they come from my research and other people that I have conducted over the years, and I also presented it to European officials. So I take a responsibility. Those are guess estimates. And they're actually conservative, because some people even think that like China's reserves in euro may actually reach 40% or even more. I think it's a bit too much, but like at least 1/3 is a kind of like a reasonable assumption. Now, again, as part of the so-called European rebalancing, there wasn't just the promotion of European space and defense interest, but also trade, and on top of trade, also monetary issues, like to have the euro as becoming an international reserve currency. And again, China has become the largest holder of euros, and understandably, because for them it is also a way to send a message to the United States and to limit the dominance of the dollar. And that was important in particular during the euro crisis, where it was actually Chinese intervention in financial markets that helped the euro stay afloat and at least maintain the value. So anyway, those are like some of the elements that, let's say, distinguish Europe's engagement, and we can call it a rebalancing towards Asia, from the United States pivot. At the same time, we also have a lot where we can work together, because those are like just elements that like identify different interests, and this is normal. Even the best allies have competing interests sometimes, especially when in this situation in Europe, like with declining growth, like to maintain jobs, you need to have companies able to export, and Asia has become such an important market. So besides the normal competition, the transatlantic allies have probably the best complementary assets to enforce a vision of Asia which is geared towards peace, security, but also values that we think are important: democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. Federica Mogherini, the new EU foreign policy chief, said in September 2014 that the United States and the European Union should pivot together in Asia. And I think she got the point, because like although we have different economic, commercial, and sometimes strategic interests, at the end of the day, we do have a lot at stake in having a stable and secure environment in Asia. And I mentioned in my brief that you have like some of the capabilities deployed by the European Union and its member states over the years in Asia that complement the United States pivot. The European Union in Asia is mainly a civilian soft power player, and when it comes to development aid, humanitarian assistance, civilian capacity building initiatives, the Europeans are possibly the best. There are those that promote more consistently rapprochement, integration, regional integration. I mentioned here a few examples which are very important, like for instance, the European Union is at the forefront of initiatives undertaken by Japan, Korea, and China towards closer integration, the trilateral cooperation initiatives, or the South Korean-inspired Northeast Asia Peace and Cooperation Initiative. Again, all initiatives that try to create an environment in Asia which is conducive for peace and security. So on these issues, I think there are probably no better allies, also in Asia, than the United States and the European Union. So I think as a matter of to come to a conclusion, then leave the floor to Le Michel. What it is needed now, which has not been done enough, and Revasso was right, is that we haven't, not even in Europe, but even less here in America, focused that much on the differences and the possible areas for cooperation, how to manage competition. That's probably been too much on the United States pivot and how the Europeans would react, and possibly now the time arrived for having a more mature discussion about what can we do together, what is possible to achieve together, and what would be the inevitable areas where economic interest may diverge. So having said that, I thank you for your attention. I leave the floor to Léo Michel.
Yeah, Professor Michel.
Okay.
That's all.
Thanks very much. I agree with about 98% of what you've heard, and I'm going to try to avoid as much as possible in my remarks any repetition of these things. But I think what I'm going to tell you actually is very complementary in terms of analysis and assessment. And to this, I also want to add some personal recommendations. Not everything, but much of what I'm going to tell you is drawn from the assessment that Christian mentioned and Nicola had mentioned that I did with a colleague of mine at INSS. We're the think tank component at National Defense University. It's available online. I don't have other copies, but if you're interested, you can see me after the program. I can give you a card and you can contact me. So what I'd like to do, and I'll try to do this in just 10 minutes, I'd like to leave maximum time for questions, is to cover 3 points. One is some general points about the European reaction as seen by American researchers. When we were in Europe last year, and I did some additional interviews this year, 2014, I think we've interviewed now probably over 6 very senior European officials, military officers, and some prominent think tank people. Then I want to focus a little bit on some of the differences that we have seen as Americans, told by Europeans, that differences among Europeans, because we've talked a little bit here a lot about the US-European relationship and competition. There's really a lot of competition within Europe. And finally, as I mentioned, I'd like to come up with a couple of policy ideas that might inform further discussion. With regard to the reactions, we saw, I'm going to be more schematic here, we saw 3 types in these broad interviews. About initial reactions to the so-called pivot, and being a good Defense Department employee here, I'm going to refer to this as the rebalance, not the pivot. There was a group that were concerned, particularly at the outset, late 2011, 2012, about a wave of US disengagement, and not only from Europe, but also it was thought from the nearby region. It was kind of one group of concerns. The second group were more specifically concerned that what they perceived as the US military focus on rebalance, which I believe is incorrect, but they saw it as that this military focus would provoke China, who the Chinese have consistently referred to rebalance as a containment strategy. Therefore, stoking tensions in the Asia-Pacific region, and for all of the things that were already mentioned, damaging European interests, particularly commercial interests. But there was a third group. There was a group of countries and officials who understood that this was a justifiable evolution of US policy, particularly as we were, at least at the time, trying to wind down US participation in 2 major long-lasting wars. But they did resent what they perceived as a lack of advanced consultation by the United States with Europe when this policy was announced. And what we found in our discussions that over the past 3 years, most of those concerns have dissipated. Although I would say they haven't entirely disappeared, but I'd say they're much less. And I would attribute this to 3 reasons. One is events. Events kept the United States interested in the nearby region. We were involved in some very substantial support for France and a little bit for the European Union. Beginning in early 2013, the French-led intervention in Mali. There's also, don't forget, there was a very disturbing incident that took place in Algeria. A few months previously, there had been the attack in Benghazi, which led us to reinforce some of our quick reaction capabilities in Europe. And then, of course, in the broader Middle East, in Syria, the rise of ISIL and so forth. So we've had to stay involved, and troop levels and the level of U.S. security commitments in those regions actually has stayed pretty much the same. In some areas, it's grown. There, of course, this year, beginning late last year, now this year, the Russia-Ukraine crisis. You've seen repeated public and private declarations, really, by U.S. leaders concerning the enduring U.S. commitment to Europe. We've backed this up with a stepped-up U.S. presence and activities, military presence and activities in Europe, both on a NATO basis and on a national basis, and a de facto halt to further drawdowns of the permanent station forces in Europe. 10 years ago, for example, our largest land unit, the U.S. Army, had about 55,000 troops in Europe. Today, the level is down to about 30,000. There was some thinking of going lower. That thinking is really, I would say, on ice, probably for a long time to come. Finally, the military aspects of the rebalance in the Asia-Pacific have actually been less dramatic than perhaps some of the early rhetoric might have suggested. There has been some repositioning of forces, but in terms of new agreements, we've really focused more on access agreements, not large-scale basing of new kind of mega bases that we had in the past, for example, in the Philippines. So now we're going to have more presence, but in terms of rotational presence in the area, for example, up to 2,000 or so Marines rotating on a roughly 6-month basis in Australia. Over time, but over a long time, perhaps 60% of our Navy will be in the Pacific Command region, PACOM, rather than the NATO region. And today it's more or less 50-50. But this has not been a dramatic surge in forces. And in fact, my own institute is looking at coming out soon with, not too soon, but in a few months, with a paper that I think will demonstrate that the real power and the real importance of the rebalance has been the economic factor and not really the military and security. It's there, but it's really not the leading edge of the rebalance. And I think as a result of this, the prevailing view in Europe today is, I'd say, a little bit more relaxed, accepting the rebalance as a natural and non-threatening evolution. And then this was mentioned, Europe is rebalancing as well, although they've avoided, perhaps more cleverly than we have, they've avoided putting a label on it. But some of the elements you've heard about. What I'd like to say a few words about, though, is how the Europeans are doing this in somewhat different ways. And so this refers more to a national basis rather than what the EU is doing. And I'm going to give you 4 examples. Let's start with Germany. China, it's not a coincidence that we put Chancellor Merkel's picture on this, greeting the Chinese president. Merkel has made 6 visits to China since she became chancellor in 2005. Germany is China's #1 trade partner in Europe, and it's really number 6 among China's trading partners worldwide. And to give you an idea of the growth of this, two-way trade between China and Germany have more than doubled between 2006 and 2013. The two countries have this formal strategic relationship, and this includes more than 60 mechanisms for dialogue between top-level Chinese and German officials. And it covers a wide range of issues: intellectual property rights, cybersecurity, rule of law, human rights, even Afghanistan. Now, German experts also told us that they are watching U.S.-China relations very closely because, of course, if those go sour, even worse, if they slide into open conflict, you can imagine that a lot of German economic interests would be at risk. But Germany is not only working with China, they have developed strategic relationships with Japan, the Republic of Korea. They're working on similar arrangements with several other countries. Their foreign office has augmented the number of personnel in Asia. And very interestingly, we were told by one senior official that many German diplomats today believe that having a solid background in Asian Pacific affairs will be just as important to their future career advancement as having a good knowledge of the United States. Military sales are an important part of German activity in Asia Pacific. They've sold conventional subs to the Republic of Korea, to India, to Singapore. Airbus Defense, which has important German participation, has sought to sell Eurofighter aircraft to Korea, to Malaysia, and as well to India, where they are competing, I'll come back to this, with our French friends. France. Now, they've been rebalancing for some time. I mean, France, to its credit, I guess, has actually been a pioneer, sometimes in a controversial way. President de Gaulle was the first of the Western leaders to formally recognize the People's Republic of China in 1964, receiving a certain amount of criticism in this country. France has a unique position in the region. It has sovereign control over several islands in the South Pacific and also in the Indian Ocean. And although the territories and populations in those regions, on those islands may be relatively small, two things. First of all, they are French territory, and there are French citizens there. So they fall automatically, if you look at the French White Book, into the first circle of French strategic requirements, which is to protect their territory. There are some modest military assets there. I think even more importantly, although the physical islands are, once again, rather small, they are dispersed. So you add these all together, and France now has the second largest exclusive economic zone, second only to the United States in the world. This is under the UN Law of the Sea, as following that definition of the UN Law of the Sea Treaty. And this has important implications for energy, for minerals, for fisheries, and for the environment. President Hollande, when he came into office, named a couple of top Asian specialists to top positions in his presidential staff. France is behind Germany, frankly, in terms of its trade relations with China, but it is trying to rectify this. It is an arms seller, I think the largest seller of military equipment to China. I can give you the figures. The figures are published, actually, by the French Defense Ministry every year and submitted to the French Parliament. And then really it's because the EU so-called embargo doesn't embargo all military sales. It really leaves to the independent member states to define what arms are covered by it, and France has defined these as, well, these are non-lethal systems. They're not selling Rafale, they're not selling missiles, per se, but they are selling militarily related equipment to China. And they are pursuing some important arms deal elsewhere. They haven't signed it yet, but the potential deal with India, which would be at least until now, the first major sale of the Rafale combat aircraft, could have a value of 15 billion euros or so. It's a large amount. I would credit the French for being much more interested and involved, deeply involved in thinking about Asia-Pacific strategic affairs. More so, I'd say, than other Europeans, with the possible exception of the British. The French pay close attention, we heard it before, to North Korean proliferation matters. They pay close attention to Chinese military developments, especially in the nuclear area, and they give high priority to maritime security and freedom of navigation issues. And in fact, the French Defense Ministry is the only one of the European allies that's published, and this was done last spring, a very comprehensive view of here are the French interests, security interests in Asia Pacific. France, they said, is a Pacific power, and this is what we intend to do about it. The UK, very briefly, they've been less concerned than the others about the US disengagement idea. I think they've been perhaps a little bit more, my view, is that they've been perhaps a little bit more disappointed than some of the other Europeans at the perceived lack of prior consultation. The Foreign Office, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, is definitely stepping up its game. In the last couple of years, they've added over 100 positions in British embassies and consulates in the region. Of course, China ranks high in UK priorities. It was the 7th ranking market for UK export goods a couple of years ago. I think the UK is the largest home, if you will, or a recipient of Chinese overseas investment in Europe. And this was certainly on display when Prime Minister Cameron was in China late last year. Well, to talk about some competition among Europeans, I would just cite, he had a very interesting phrase where he was telling the Chinese in China that, quote, some in Europe, we are not, he said, like some in Europe who want to shut China off behind a bamboo curtain of trade barriers. And he wasn't talking about the United States, he was talking about some of his fellow Europeans. A good note about the UK, I think they've been very attentive and very wise about this in attracting some important senior military officers from Asia Pacific, Chinese, but also others, to their professional military education institutes in the UK. And I think this is very intelligent policy, good networking. Finally, Norway. This is a very interesting example of a smaller country that's really grasped the importance of the rebalance and also of Asia Pacific for a couple of reasons. The defense minister has given a couple of very good speeches on this, and she's argued that the US rebalance makes an important contribution to global security. And I think that's an important point to recognize in all of this. It's not just about US interests very narrowly defined. It has to do with our interests and our support for allies. We have very important allies in Europe. We have 5 treaty allies in Asia Pacific. And her argumentation was that, look, if Asia Pacific is important to an ally, Norway's ally through NATO, it ought to be important to NATO allies. And this interesting example of how Norway wanted to support this is that Norway sent a frigate. It was the only European to send a frigate, with the exception of the French, to participate in the Pacific Command's largest, I think it's an every 2-year exercise called RIMPAC, Rim of the Pacific. It was held this summer. And the Norwegians were very clever about it because they pursued their strategic goal. They wanted to show a presence there. They wanted to become familiar with the operating area. And by the way, they also carried out a test of a very advanced Norwegian surface-to-surface naval missile, successful test. It impressed a lot of the other countries there. I think they might get some more customers. And among the new customers they might get might even be the US Navy. It turns out that the Norwegian missile, which they demonstrated at this US-led exercise, is a weapon that we don't have in our Navy stockpile. Finally, a couple of recommendations. We've heard, and I agree with this, that Americans and Europeans have a lot of shared strategic objectives in Asia Pacific. These include liberal trade regimes, freedom of navigation, maritime security, peaceful resolution of disputes, non-proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, promoting respect for human rights and democratic values. These are important things. How could we work on these better together? And I'll give you 4 ideas. First of all, I mentioned the at least perceived, and let's face it, maybe even a real lack of consultation in late 2011, 2012. One way to remedy this is to have more regular, high-level, and substantive consultations between US and European officials on the diplomatic and economic and security aspects of the rebalance. And these should not just be informational briefs. I tell you what I'm doing, you tell me, and we all go home. This really is an opportunity for discussions of priorities, options for future strategies, from learning from one another. I think Europe has a lot to offer this, and to his credit, Kurt Campbell has recognized this. Second point, not all allies, not all countries are created alike, I'm sorry to say. I mentioned France, I mentioned the UK. I think there's room for expanded military-to-military relations between US Pacific Command and the commander of the French maritime forces in the Pacific, and upgrading also of the status of the UK representative at US PACOM. And I believe I can tell you that in the past year or so, we're seeing some movement in this direction. These expanded relationships underscore the French, or the shared French, US, and UK interests in freedom of navigation. They facilitate cooperative planning for contingencies, and these could include humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, and non-combatant evacuation operations. A third suggestion, I think there is room to expand NATO, Central Command, and EU maritime cooperation in the Indian Ocean, where they could work with the other navies, India, Australia, New Zealand, China, and possibly even Pakistan, who are interested at various levels in ensuring the security of sea lines of communication that link Europe, the Gulf energy producers, and Asia-Pacific trading partners. Francois, and I agree with him, made reference to this. And finally, it is an EU point. You know, in 2012, then Secretary of State Clinton and then High Rep Catherine Ashton signed a joint declaration, I think it was in Myanmar at the time, where they outlined 6 or 7? Cambodia, I'm sorry. 6 or 7 very substantive areas of US-EU cooperation. At least based on our interviews, I think that some of the momentum was lost, but the ideas are there, and I think we ought to get to work on them. Thank you.
Thank you very much for these very insightful comments. I'd like to invite Ambassador Vassaux for some further thoughts or comments on the subject.
Thank you.
It's on.
It's extremely challenging to speak after these 2 speeches. You know, your endeavor is to be either superficial, either well informed. So maybe I shall just try to complement a bit, or maybe to nuance slightly 2 or 3 points. One, space. Leo, you have not maybe completed what Mr. Casarini has said, with great reason. But about Galileo, for example. Nicola, you have said that Galileo, we had developed Galileo in a very open way. It is true. But, you know, we are also now in a post 9/11 world. That's it. We are in the post-2010 world, post-2008 world, as you want to tell it. Post-economic crisis. And after this economic crisis, I think there is a bigger feeling of solidarity between US and EU, which comes from the fact that we both know that in a world where we have more emerging powers than before, with more strength than before, our 2 societies, our 2 capabilities of influence are not reduced in absolute, but are reduced in relative strength in the world. I remember when I was director for UN in 1993, sending instruction to the UN Security Council. I made history every day, and students for 10 years have asked me questions about the policy on Somalia, on Cambodia. Cambodia, great interest for Europe because of the Cambodian minorities in Europe. On whatever, Haiti, Yugoslavia, obviously. Because what we decided in the P3 became immediately law. Now it's not the case. The situation is extremely different. Very, very different. For one exception, like Libya or like Mali, you have tens of counterexamples. So we have this knowledge, this feeling that we have to act together if we want to keep our influence. That's part also of the design of TTIP. So for Galileo, situation is has a bit evolved. First, because the EU is developing a security dimension, there is, as you know, a potential security dimension in Galileo, and the future of this security dimension, we don't discuss it with China, we discuss it with the US. because we will need in the future to have probably a certain level of complementarity between GPS and Galileo, and possibly a number of economic, meaningful reduction of costs for the post-GPS and post-Galileo systems. So, you know, I think the 5 last years have strengthened our solidarity in Asia, even in the fields where we were previously more competing. That will be my first remark. My second remark is that, and particularly in the field of security. So on the field of security, I see a growing complementarity, which goes par with the fact that we develop our interaction with Asia in terms of security. If I look at the last one's news I have, I see that in October this year, 1 month ago, we have had a summit with Asia, with China, a bilateral one, and we have engaged our first strategic dialogue, security dialogue with China. Dialogue on security and defense, which took place for the first time on the 10th of October this year. And we continue these exchanges by holding the first high-level seminar on security and defense in China in December. In many aspects, this kind of approaches remind me the kind of approaches we had with the Eastern Europe in 1989, when NATO extended the hand to former enemies. You know, we are at a very low level. We are far behind the level of contacts and interaction between US and China, for example, than we see for maritime incidents management, for air to surface or surface to air maritime management. That is very important, but we shall follow that. We shall follow suit. We shall benefit on that also. So on this aspect, there is a good point. On economics, we still have to advance in one aspect, which is maybe the difficult one today between US and EU, which is something that we tend to perceive as a problem of phasing between the Asian trade negotiation and the transatlantic trade negotiations. Because the TPP, the trade negotiation between US and Asia, have started now more than 7 years ago, the US administration wants to complete it quickly, which is normal, which is desirable. As I said, we support that. And wants to complete it during this mandate of President Obama as the best illustration of a pivot to Asia, of a rebalancing, to Asia by the US. Yes, we support that. But we would not like to see that damaging the TTIP negotiation. We have been a bit frustrated, I have to say, and we hope that this will be corrected. It's still plenty of time to correct, not plenty of time, but at least plenty of days to correct it. Because we tend to think that maybe we are a wrong impression, maybe we are wrong, but the impression, the perception in Europe is that the US want to conclude TPP before really going to the TTIP negotiation in depth and in serious. Why? Because they need to have an authorization by Congress, and Congress tend to see Europe as a fortress, protectionist fortress, and so sees US with offensive interest, Europe with defensive interest in the field of trade, transatlantic trade, and the balance being a sort of a middle ground between the defensive interest of Europe and the offensive interest of US. And obviously this was true 20 years ago, but is completely wrong today. Today we probably have more offensive interest than US in the field of trade, including in agriculture, just imagine. And the US administration, who knows that, is not necessarily very keen to expose that publicly in a debate, which will necessarily be the case if the negotiation was in its last phase, and if the negotiation was, as we wish, transparent, because the EU has made the principle of transparency one of the principles of its negotiation. And so we see that the situation is not optimal. We would like to engage immediately on the substance of TTIP, not having to wait the completion of TPP. And the US says, don't worry, we shall have, they use a nice formula, the capability of walking and chewing at the same time, making two things at the time. But in practice, they count of the end of 2015 to really address the negotiation. And this is the tradition of the US here, to negotiate at the last minute and to cut the deals at the last minute. But they have never negotiated a TPA with us. And the EU cannot cut a deal in 15 days because we have some structural constraints there. We need to inform member states. We need to get their approval. We need to respect all the procedural steps which are required in such a complex negotiation. So, the pivot to Asia, or the rebalancing to Asia, was meant to pose a number of problems in the defense field. Probably not. It is maybe the pivot to Asia in the trade field, which could have unforeseen and involuntary, because it's not, there's no hidden agenda there or no special perfidy, but bureaucratic difficulties. Basically, we will have maybe a bit more problem in this field than in the security field. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So let's open it up. Let's take a round of questions. If you could please wait for the microphone and state your name and affiliation if you like. Why don't we start with the gentleman up front here and then go
Thank you very much. My name is Naran Kiritis. I'm from, used to teach at SAIS, Johns Hopkins University, and also the senior staff of the IMF. My comment is on the approach, the so-called Asia pivot by Europe and Asia pivot by the United States. It's obvious in the recent APEC meeting in Beijing, followed by the ASEAN meeting in Myanmar, then in Australia, that the Chinese tributary system based on bilateral relationship is prevailing over the international or multilateral relation. Why did I say that? Because simply that, for instance, Abe of Japan, as if you watch the TV France 24, the way Abe was shaking hand with the president of China was not what I call a warm handshaking. Far from it. Then followed by South Korea, also bilateral, dealing with China. Then don't forget, before that, it was Vietnam, in spite of the fact that the United States promised to even transfer under the so-called Asia pivot nuclear technology to Vietnam. And more recently, the United States asked Vietnam to allow the United States have the base at Cam Ranh Bay and so forth. Vietnam, as usual, smart enough, absolutely refused that and decide to deal directly with China, so the tributary system of China prevail. In this sense, I want you to evaluate, is this change still Asia pivot as advocated by Mr. Leo Michel, is still applicable or completely out of the game?
Thank you.
That's my question. Thank you.
Thank you. Would like to take that on. Yeah?
Well,
First, I think to answer.
let me answer it a different way. Because I'm not, I'm not an Asian specialist, but I've focused on Europe and came into this with my colleague, who's the real Asian specialist here. But a couple of additional remarks. What we saw in our discussion with European specialists and matching that with some of our discussions, particularly my colleagues' discussions with senior officials in Asia Pacific, there is still a very, very widespread perception, but I think it really is wrong, that the rebalance is only about China. The Chinese continue to say it is. As I said, they continue to, when my colleagues who are the Chinese experts go and then they come back and tell me about their discussions with the People's Liberation Army Institute and National Defense University and so forth. That's what it's all about. It's, why are you surrounding us? You're just treating us like the Soviet Union during the Cold War. And it's a very, very monodimensional view of what's going on. The U.S. has a lot of interest in the region. Part of it is concerns about China. Part of it is developing a better relationship with China. But a lot of it is reassuring allies and developing a better relationship with allies. And it's not necessarily a zero-sum game. The Chinese always seem to portray it as that, but it really isn't. Because a lot of what we are doing, once again, it's not just security. It's the economic relationships. It's the developing relationships with multilateral organizations in Asia Pacific. It's diplomatic outreach. It's the very important trade sector. Francois knows a lot more about it. There's just, there's a particular Chinese narrative out there that portrays everything as military containment, which I think is simply wrong.
Just a few words on that. Like, I think Asians often are more sophisticated than the Western mind. They don't have a black and white approach. Many times, not always, but many times, my experience going to Asia is that a more differentiated approach. What I'm saying is the following. They are aware that they cannot have bad relations with China, all the neighboring countries in Asia. You cannot have a bad relationship with China. At the same time, they also want to be reassured, some countries, about an environment which is safe, where the China's tributary system will not become the norm. In this kind of like tension, there are a lot of possibilities, which means that like look at countries like Korea now, the way Korea is approaching China, even like and creating also sometimes like problems with the United States because like also on security issues. Vietnam is actually an excellent case because like you do have sometimes, depending on the political cycles, like a rapprochement towards China, but then asking the United States to do more. And I think it will be a common feature in the future to have this kind of like what I call more sophisticated approach, neither black nor white. And it is difficult for us in the West to get into this kind of mindset. Maybe the Europeans can get it a little bit better, if only because we have almost 50, 60 years of experience in trying to find a compromise among now 28 member states. So if only for this kind of practice, you can see when you are in Asia that Asians, in particular Southeast Asians, but also the Koreans, want more Europe. That's the usual question. We want more Europe. We want a different actor that could help us create some kind of like more sophisticated approach to an otherwise tug of war or competition between the two giants, the United States and the Chinese. And I think many Asians don't want to have to choose. Like probably we don't have to in Europeans in Asia. So it's on security close to the United States, but economically, and again with different shades of gray in between.
Okay, yeah, in the back.
May I also, yeah, maybe.
Briefly, yes.
Yeah.
It's on.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you. But it is because China has begun to draw some lessons of the experience in 2011, 2012, where a more bullying approach of the neighbors didn't work. So now they are taking a more clever approach and waiting for Westerners to make mistakes, such as the one you mentioned. Maybe we have also another kind of small added value, I would say, which strikes me when it comes, not in the economic field, but when it comes to security fields. I'm always surprised, my dear Leo, sorry to say so, about some kind of naivete in Pentagon about understanding the local cultures. You know, I remember when the 200 French in Mali stand up to stop the 10,000 jihadists who were going to Bamako. I went these days and I said, look, we are going to stop them. And they say, you are completely mad. You need 20,000 men. I said, no, it's not Afghanistan. No, it's not Iraq. It's Mali, where they speak French like us, where we know where to go, where we have a map of every small cave. It's not the same thing. in Vietnam, I don't think a European would have made the same mistake, you know. So, and let's be cynical, don't quote me, please. But it's also because we have a common history with these countries. It was a colonial history, yes, but it gives us some common understanding, which I hope we should share more, with the hope that the US military way of thinking, because you have won all the battles for a certain time, has become a bit more working in a sort of a circle, and maybe we can inject some better knowledge of some grounds, and this will help also.
All right. Yes.
Yeah, my name is Emre Karaca. I work here at the Wilson Center. I have a little question, or maybe some remarks too. It's about
Really shortly, though, we're running out of
I'll
time.
make it as short as possible. It's about the entire discourse. So when we talk about a pivot or rebalancing, it's always about East Asia, and I think we kind of miss out the conversation about the space in between. Let's say the space between Europe and Asia, which is not on the maritime front, but you know, the land. Let's say Central Asia and all its implications for energy security in Asia as well as in Europe. For example, we have a lot of different challenges right now in Germany and France, so the energy mix is changing, so we kind of depend more on fossil fuels in these regions. South Stream was just put on hold or put on ice. Now we have some other pipeline projects going over Turkey and Azerbaijan, maybe possibly extending to Turkmenistan in the future over the Caspian Sea. But if we want to really have some access to these kind of resources, we have to compete with the Russians and the Chinese for this stuff. So where's this part in the conversation? We should not just focus on East Asian trade and all the maritime sphere. I think we have to do some rebalancing in our discourse as well.
Thank you. Anyone like to take this on? Otherwise, we can, I think, can actually take this as a comment.
I accept the point.
Yeah, and we'll take this as a good comment. So thank you. Any other questions? Yeah. Okay. Why don't we take a couple of questions and then give the panelists a final chance for a final response? Yeah.
I'm Rebecca Galanti. I'm a sophomore at GW. This is actually a question for a paper I'm writing. Where on Mogherini's list of priorities can we expect this pivot to Asia to fall, given, Russia's aggression and ISIS creeping up on the back door? How much time and energy can we expect her and the EU in general to devote to strategizing this pivot, given other pressing security concerns?
That's a good question. Thank you. We'll go to, the gentleman there.
My question is on...
Introduce yourself, please.
Sorry, Daniel Jackson with the Department of State. My question is about Southeast Asia, specifically what role the EU and EU countries can play in kind of fostering democracy and human rights in Myanmar, where they're transitioning to a democracy, and also in Thailand, where we're seeing a democratic regression, I guess you could say.
Okay, any other questions? Then right there, and that'll be the last one, then we'll a final round of responses.
My name is Reynolds. I'm an academic from Australia. My question is about the nuclear relationship in Asia, particularly the resumption of sales to India. The day before the pivot was announced in Australia, we relaxed our uranium sales to India. The Nuclear Suppliers Group had already, with European support, provided a relaxation of those restrictions as well. So my question is this: has the decision to supply uranium and technology to India raised concerns about Europe's response to, say, Pakistan, or the absence of an Asia order like Euratom? And are you considering the resumption of different defence relationships, particularly in the area of nuclear submarines, where, of course, American allies are denied that sort of technology?
Okay, thank you. 3 questions, 3 minutes, 3 speakers. Where do we start?
1 minute for me.
Okay, we'll start with that.
First question, what priority for Mogherini? I have them written. I can just, because it's still secret, read you. It is recommended, Mrs. Mogherini, that your flag priorities for EU engagement in Asia-Pacific in 2015 start at the January meeting of a Commissioner Group of External Action, CGEA, and you will introduce a number of new policy initiatives on Asia, which will require wide coordination. So you know, we started the 1st of December. This note is dated the 3rd of December, so no time is lost. On Myanmar and Thailand, human rights, yes. It's a priority for us. The difficulty, you know, that you feel also in Africa, is that when we probably have to find a new way of raising our concerns for human rights. We have, let's be honest, till now established a number of conditionalities between human rights and aid, and we have always human rights in the center of our dialogues with these countries. It will remain at the center, because for us it's central to our values and rule of law. Now, the way of establishing conditionality will probably have to be adapted a bit. I don't know in what sense, possibly in a more selective way or more differentiated way, more subtle way, you know. But we probably have to adapt, otherwise we shall finish by becoming slightly irrelevant. If we want to have a capacity of influence, we have to try to maximize it, not to minimize it. And this is in this dilemma between how to maximize our influence on human rights in the most clever way that we have still to reflect. But it will remain central to our reflection about Myanmar and Thailand. And we are worried, and we repeat that regularly. Now, to repeat it is one thing. It irritates people. When it produces effect, it's good. When it doesn't produce effect, we have to think what else could do, or how differently should we do the thing. We have to take into account the fact that our universal value approach may have corresponded to a specific period of history, but maybe we are entering in a new period of history, and we have to adapt not our values, but the way we transmit them. Third question, I think I shall just defer to Leo on that.
All right. Nicola?
Shall I go?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. I will concentrate on the important question about Mogherini, since the others. Now, one of the few portfolios, possibly the biggest one, which has not yet been allocated in the current cabinet, is about Asia. If you go on the website, there's nobody yet focusing on Asia. That's why your question is a very important one. Now, I think that it will become an issue in the following way. When it comes to trade, it will be DG Trade. Cecilia Malmström will be in town, actually in a few days, Monday, and she will have, Cecilia Malmström is the new commissioner for trade. And so when it comes to trade, we have, institutionally speaking, within the European Commission, a commissioner. But when it comes to security and foreign affairs issues, I think Federica will have to tackle Asia for the back door. When Leo Michel was mentioning the policy suggestions towards the end of his presentations, he mentioned two, which I think are important but also problematic for Europe, which is military cooperation between the United States and some of the member states, like France and the UK, and enlarging NATO Central Command to include also Asian powers. Why these issues will become more and more important and force Mogherini's cabinet to take action? Because now we are speaking about important elements that, of course, member states are free to decide, like on military security issues. But it also at stake the possibility of the EU to send a unitary message to the region. So I think that in the next weeks, Federica will be forced to think strategically about Asia, because some member states, in particular France and the UK, will present her with the case, or not even present her, she will have to step in and make a case where Europe stand. If you have some member states joining the United States Pacific Rim, then the Chinese ambassador will ask Federica Mogherini, where do the European Union stand in that? Are you enforcing? So I think these kind of issues will be very interesting to follow in the next weeks and months. Little energy, little time, and the fact that the person dealing with Asia has not yet been appointed is an indication. Priorities are neighborhood, of course, Ukraine, Russia, Middle East. But sooner or later, we'll be there through the back door. And by the way, that's why, as you find in my policy brief, following on what Leo Michel said, I think what we need now is more consultations. In fact, that's why my third point is to have a regular dialogue between the Asia person in the Mogherini cabinet, once we have him or her, and the office of the Assistant Secretary of State for Asian Pacific Affairs, something that has never been created, a regular dialogue. I always indicated like some more dialogue between Congress and the European Parliament and high-level consultations. I called it a Transatlantic Forum on Asia, high-level consultations. We agree we need more in terms of sharing and trying to find out a workable compromise. And when it comes to security military, that will be very interesting to observe the next developments.
Any final comments, Professor Michel?
On South Asia, to my knowledge, the United States does not have any military nuclear relationship at all with Pakistan, with India. The United States agreement with India, which is not a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, was based on the fact that the Indians were making equivalent safeguards that gave assurance to the United States that the nuclear energy relationship, that is for peaceful nuclear purposes, would not be diverted for military purposes. That said, India already had a nuclear arsenal. Pakistan has one that's, according to a number of reports, is growing even faster than the Indian ones. What those countries try to do in developing even at-sea capabilities is something that they're doing. The United States is not selling nuclear submarines or nuclear propulsion, anything to do with that to either of those countries. That said, I mean, we have 3 countries, the UK, France, the United States, 3 of the P5. There are nuclear weapon states. And in our individual relations, discussions with Pakistanis, with Indians, I think it's legitimate and maybe even useful to remind them about the responsibilities of when you have nuclear weapons, of assuring their security, so that they are not, they don't become loose nukes, and also to make them aware of the dangers and the risks of miscommunication, should God forbid that ever lead to a nuclear confrontation in South Asia, which would, of course, change the world. Let me mention just one other thing, and Francois, I can't help. I don't want to respond to your, I'm not here as a representative of the Pentagon, but I think you know, in all fairness, you can give people there a little bit more credit for having learned some lessons from history, which, France had lessons to learn as well from its experience in Indochina. But there are ways where independent and proud countries can actually help each other out. Earlier this year, I think it was in January, there was a 2+2 meeting in France between France and Japan, where the foreign ministers and defense ministers sat down for a couple of days. If you go back, I don't know if it exists in English, but for those who read French, go back and read the joint communique, where the French and the Japanese were agreeing on the importance of peaceful resolution of disputes, of maritime security. But they were going beyond that, and trade, of course. But they were talking also about the importance of cooperation elsewhere in the world, in counter-piracy. Japan has been an active supporter, financially at least, in stabilization efforts in Afghanistan. Japan is also interested, and it's mentioned in the communique, about a growing role in stabilization and development and so forth in the Sahel region, in cooperation with the European Union and France there. There's no mention of the United States in any of this. But I would not hesitate to say that you could strike out in that communique almost every mention of France and put the United States, and the themes would be the same. And I also can assure you that we did not have a hand in writing that joint communique. But it's important to the Japanese to have that relationship with a European country. It's a important European country. It's important for the French to have that. And it ends up solidifying the type of relationship that helps these shared interests that I try to emphasize, not the competitive ones, but the shared strategic interests that we have with Europe in cooperation in Asia Pacific for the betterment of both of our continents.
Good. Those are perhaps good words to end on. Let's give a round of applause to our three speakers.
Thanks.
For really, I think, terrific panel. Thank all of you for joining us. Hope to see you again sometime soon at a Global Europe event here at the Wilson Center. Thank you.